Week 8 of the fantasy football season is here. I'm Jen Piacenti with Sports Illustrated, and joining me today to help you set those winning lineups are senior fantasy analyst Michael Fabiano. Fabs, let's start off with the quarterback position. Who should we lock and load this weekend?
Beam me up, Captain Kirk Cousins. How about that one? Coming off a bye. I love the matchup. It's a dad joke. I get it. I love the matchup against the Arizona Cardinals. Their defense just gave up nearly 27 fantasy points to Andy Dalton last week. And they've also struggled against the position overall. 18 plus fantasy points to 4 different quarterbacks. So get Cousins into your lineup. And then Tua Tagovailoa's got a good matchup too. Last week he was okay. Scored just fewer than 16 fantasy points, which actually is acceptable this year because the quarterback position has been so bad. But he's got the Lions this week. 4 quarterbacks have scored 18 plus fantasy points against Detroit, including 2 who've gone over 27. So start Tua.
I enjoyed watching our Dallas Cowboys play the Lions last week, but I digress. Let's move on to who we're sitting at quarterback. You don't like Aaron Rodgers this week. You just don't trust him.
2 big names. We talk about the quarterback position and its deterioration this year. I mean, Aaron Rodgers is near the top of that list. This guy cannot score more than 16 points in a game. He doesn't trust his wide receivers. If it weren't for Aaron Jones last week, he wouldn't have had a big game. He's got Buffalo this week. Only one quarterback, and that was Patrick Mahomes, has scored more than 13.1 fantasy points in a game against Buffalo. Aaron Rodgers is a fade, and so is Matthew Stafford. He had a week off. Maybe the elbow feels a little bit better, but I am not trusting him against the San Francisco 49ers. He had a 6.8 point stinker against them earlier in the season, and this is a very tough matchup for Stafford. I know Mahomes went off on San Francisco last week. I think that's an outlier. I'm keeping Stafford on the bench.
Any chance you're willing to trade Stafford to me in our SI league? Because I'm desperate, but I'll call you later about that. All right, moving over to the running back position.
Someone else is actually asking for Stafford too. You have competition.
Oh, really? Well, it's a 2 QB league, so I guess interesting. I'm going to have to think. You can't have Cooper Kupp. All right, moving over to the running back position. You've got a guy here that a trade went down this week, and this guy's stock was already on the way up, and now it's got to be just sky high.
Yeah, Travis Etienne. I mean, the second that trade happened, his agent texted me and said, it's Travis's time. Well, I was hoping it would be his time in week 1, but I guess better late than never, right? He's been great. Now he's the true featured back in Jacksonville. 46.1 combined fantasy points in his last 3 games. Now he's got a matchup against the Broncos. Now the Broncos defense is pretty tough, but they have allowed over 20 fantasy points to 2 running backs since week 4. So I am fine starting Travis Etienne. And then Miles Sanders. Folks, I will admit it right here. I almost never get this guy right, so take this with a grain of salt. But it's a great matchup against the Steelers, all right? He's in the RB2 conversation against this defense. They've allowed 6 different running backs to score 15 plus points against them, including 3 who've gone over 20. This is a great matchup for Miles Sanders. Let's hope he can make good on it.
I can help you out with the Miles Sanders start. Basically, if I'm playing someone that's starting Miles Sanders will go off, and I am. So I think it's a good call. All right, as far as who we're sitting at running back, a first rounder has not delivered. It's finally time that you have to make the tough decision, and he sits on the bench.
There are only 2 teams on a bye this week, the Chiefs and the Chargers, so maybe some people have the depth to sit Najee Harris. He's been brutal, and I don't know that it's his fault either. The Steelers' offense has been pretty brutal overall. We all miss Ben Roethlisberger. Strange to say that. He's averaging fewer than 11 fantasy points per game. This is a first-round pick. And you look at the defense for the Philadelphia Eagles, they have been very tough on their home field. They've only allowed 1 touchdown, and they've allowed the 3rd fewest fantasy points to running backs at Lincoln Financial Field. So keep tabs on that matchup. It's not a good one. Najee Harris is a risk, and so is Darrell Henderson. Now, the good news is that it looks like he's the starter, right? Cam Akers appears to be in the doghouse there, but the matchup's not great against the 49ers. They've allowed just 1 touchdown and more than 16.5 fantasy points per game against them at the running back position. This is not a great matchup, and also keep this in mind. These 2 teams played each other back in week 4. Henderson and Cam Akers combined for 8.2 points. Jen, that's not good.
Cam Akers appears to be in the doghouse there is one of the nicest ways of putting that. I appreciate that. A wide receiver starts. You like someone coming off a bye, Devonta Smith. And then, I'm so excited about this one. You say it's okay to finally feel comfortable about starting DJ Moore.
Right, and we'll start off with Smith there in the city of brotherly love. He's been really hot, 15 plus fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games, and the Steelers' defense is just not good. I mean, they've allowed 9 touchdowns and the second most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. So Devontae Smith is a very strong wide receiver 2 or flex. And we talk about DJ Moore. He had been on the sit list almost every week, and we were right almost every week, except for last week, where he busted out for 19.6 fantasy points. He had a big game. Now I get it, there's risk. PJ Walker is still the quarterback there, but Atlanta's defensive backfield is a little bit banged up right now, and enemy wide receivers have scored 11 touchdowns and averaged the most fantasy points per game after 7 weeks. So I do like DJ Moore as a flex this week.
He had a massive air yard share, a massive target share, and it feels like with no Christian McCaffrey there, they better get their best weapon into the game plan, and maybe they'll be riding high after the success they had versus Tom Brady and the Bucs. All right, we're sitting a couple of wide receivers, one in Cleveland, and then this one, I wonder if this will change. There are rumors about a trade for Chase Claypool. Would you change your mind on Deontay Johnson if that should go down? I know that's a lot of, ifs, but tell me what you think about these wide receiver sits.
We'll start with Amari Cooper. Now, you probably have to play him. I get it. I'm in a league, I have to play him. But the matchup's not great. The Bengals defense is playing really well, folks. I mean, look at the numbers. This unit has been really tough on perimeter receivers. Only Tyreek Hill, who's a superstar, has scored more than 14.5 fantasy points in a game against Cincinnati. Overall, they've given up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to receivers who line out wide. So maybe temper your expectations on Amari Cooper. And then Deontay Johnson, I guess the answer to your question is Ben Roethlisberger coming back, because I really miss him, because I liked starting Deontay Johnson over the last couple of years. This year, you can't trust him. He's got the Eagles, and oh, by the way, how about Darius Slay, one of the top cover corners in the National Football League? The Eagles have allowed 3 touchdowns and the 5th fewest fantasy points to perimeter receivers. So Deontay Johnson, once again, Jen, is a risk for me. If I have depth, I'm sitting him.
Yeah, he's tough to start, but you don't have any issue starting the tight end for Pittsburgh, and it looks like you're following the rule here, death, taxes, and tight ends versus the Cardinals.
That's right. So Pat Freiermuth was on this list last week. We said to start him. He had a big game. And tight ends were ridiculously thin. And you don't have Travis Kelce this week. Gerald Everett, who's been a starter in a lot of fantasy leagues, he's out as well. So I'm going to go with Freiermuth. I know the matchup seems bad on paper. The Eagles defense is tough, but they've allowed Irv Smith Jr. and Jake Ferguson to beat them for more than 14 points at home. So they're not great against tight ends. I think Freiermuth is certainly a good play. And then Irv Smith, you mentioned it. You play the Cardinals, and suddenly you are in the spotlight from a fantasy perspective. This defense has allowed 6 touchdowns and the 2nd most fantasy points to tight ends. In fact, Jen, 7 different tight ends, 7, have scored at least 10 fantasy points against the Cardinals. So start Irv Smith.
Yeah, and I think he's still on some waiver wires too. So if you need a replacement for Travis Kelce, that could be your guy. All right, as far as who we're sitting at tight end, this one breaks my heart. I think it breaks a lot of people's hearts, but give us the tough news.
But you know what? Most people have to play Kyle Pitts. You drafted him in the 3rd round unless you were able to pick up somebody off the waiver wire. And I don't know that there's that many players you can pick up off the wire and replace him with. Maybe it's Irv Smith, but Pitts has been terrible. And part of the problem is that the Falcons are throwing the ball 42% of the time. In Marcus Mariota's last 2 games, 27 pass attempts, not per game, combined. That's really bad. And the Panthers have allowed just 1 tight end to score more than 10.4 fantasy points against them. So beware Kyle Pitts. And I'm also sitting Evan Ingram. He's playing overseas this week in London. I'm not going to try to do the accent. He was really good last week. We told you to play him against the Giants, but I don't love the matchup against Denver. Their defense has allowed just 2 tight ends to score more than 8.3 fantasy points this year, and no tight end has scored more than 13.3 points against Denver's defense. Their offense right now is a mess, but the Broncos defense is still pretty formidable. I'm sitting Evan Ingram.
I'm disappointed we didn't get the George Costanza hello from you, Fabs. I was totally counting on that. Guys, once again, Fabiano gives us the best advice, and we have his rankings for every single position over at SI.com Fantasy, so be sure to check that out. And yes, it even includes kickers. But before you go, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because we will be bringing you our waiver wire and start sit videos every week of the fantasy football season.